Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this IFS post-budget briefing. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and I will be joined very soon, or indeed am joined by four of my fantastic colleagues who have been beavering away overnight, analysing what was in yesterday's budget. You will hear from Isabel Stockton, from Bea Boileau, from Tom Wernham, and from Helen Miller later on. But first, I will, as is traditional now, make some opening remarks about the budget and put it, I think, in a little bit of context for the rest of the year and the election. I think the first thing to say is that nothing that Jeremy Hunt did yesterday, nor indeed anything that the OBR said, changes anything, actually, very significantly, which is a bit of a shame, because that means we're still heading for a parliament in which people will on average be worse off at the end than at the start. That's pretty much unprecedented. Looking at a debt to GDP ratio that it's its highest level in 70 years and is showing no signs of falling. We're facing debt interest payments at close to all-time highs, seeing worrying increases in the number of individuals moving on to health and disability related benefits, which is bringing huge challenges for those households, but also very quick rising costs for the public purse. Despite the genuinely significant cuts in national insurance contributions, we're stuck in a situation where tax revenues will have risen by a record amount as a share of national income over this parliament and are still heading towards UK record levels. And we're still implicitly planning on big cuts in public investment spending overall and cuts to many areas of day-to-day spending on public services, despite the very obvious signs of strain in many areas. All of that was true on Tuesday. It all remains true today. It will almost certainly all remain true come the general election. So if little overall in the economic forecast has changed, we should at least be grateful that the OBR got slightly less downbeat in its forecast for household income. While it reiterated that 2022-23 was the worst year for household income since records began in the 1950s, it at least now thinks incomes will return to their pre-pandemic levels by 2025, 2 years earlier than previously thought. That's a welcome improvement, but it does still mean that average household incomes this autumn are likely to be lower than they were in autumn 2019. Not a happy prospect. It's worth noting one other set of forecast changes. In his speech, Mr. Hunt, on several occasions, stressed that his growth plans were not predicated on high levels of migration. Yet the OBR are quite clear. Higher immigration will offset a greater than previously expected fall in labour force participation. The number of inactive working age adults has climbed by 700,000 since before the pandemic to 9.3 million. And Mr. Hunt's boasts about higher GDP growth in the UK relative to other countries also depend on high population growth. We have not had good growth in GDP per person. All that said, this really has been and is a difficult period for any Chancellor. The combination of elevated debt, low nominal growth and high interest rates means that we need to be running much tighter fiscal policy than usual if we want to get the debt down. Just to stop debt rising, we need to run a substantial primary surplus. That is, we need to raise more in tax and other revenues than we spend on everything other than debt interest. That's something we haven't done as a country since 2001, and it's a tough ask. Ignoring the vagaries of the current, frankly pretty bizarre fiscal targets, these underlying facts are going to constrain chancellors for the foreseeable future. Fiscal rules or no, fiscal realities bite. The combination of high debt interest payments and low forecast growth means that the next parliament could well prove to be the most difficult of any in 80 years for a chancellor wanting to bring debt down. Even stabilising debt as a fraction of national income is likely to mean some eye-wateringly tough choices. And we're talking tens of billions of pounds worth of tough choices on tax and spending. You can see that easily enough by looking at what Mr. Hunt says he's planning. On his figures, debt is rising slowly to 27-28 before falling by a minuscule amount as a share of national income in the following year. But that requires him to assume a whole series of unlikely or undesirable things. Perhaps unlikeliest of all is that the supposedly temporary 1-year 5p cut on fuel duty, originally put in place in April 22, will expire in a year's time, and rates of fuel duties will then rise in line with inflation, despite having been frozen yesterday for the 15th year in a row. So half of his headroom is taken up if that doesn't happen. So that seems to be highly unlikely. Highly undesirable is that investment spending is due to fall by £18 billion a year in real terms. That is a big cut. If it was even slightly undone, that loses him his fiscal headroom. Somewhere between the highly unlikely and the highly undesirable lies the effective promise that day-to-day spending on a range of public services outside of health, defence and education will fall by something like £20 billion a year by the end of the period. Maybe that's possible, but keeping to these plans would require some staggeringly hard choices, which the government has not been willing to lay out. Indeed, we heard yesterday that the next spending review, in which these choices will have to be announced, will rather conveniently not happen until after the election. One only has to look at the scale of NHS waiting lists, the number of local authorities at or near bankruptcy, the backlogs in the justice system, the long-term cuts to university funding, the struggles of the social care system, to wonder where these cuts will rarely, really credibly come from. Remarkably, in this context, Mr. Hunt also stuck with and made the claim that he wants defence spending to rise to 2.5% of national income, quotes, as soon as economic conditions allow, unquotes. Well, economic conditions allowed a 10 billion cut in national insurance this year, so they could have allowed a 10 billion increase in defence spending. That would have just about met the target. Actions speak louder than words. Put the national insurance cuts together with those implemented in January, and you have a genuinely substantial tax cut worth up to £1,500 a year for higher rate taxpayers and over £1,000 a year for those on just above average earnings. And I do welcome the fact that Mr. Hunt again chose to cut national insurance rather than income tax. It's better targeted on those in work of working age, and it reduces the wedge between taxes on different sorts of income. Note, though, that this means that while many workers will be better off as a result of tax changes over this Parliament, pensioners will be substantial net losers. Well over 60% of pensioners now pay income tax. That's a big increase in the last 15 years or so. Income tax changes will leave most of them £650 a year worse off by 2027 and over £3,000 a year worse off if they're higher rate taxpayers. And remember, they didn't benefit anywhere near as much either from the increases in the personal allowance back in the 2010s. So this is rather counter to the narrative we've had over quite a long period. I think quite deliberately, and I'm not saying this is unwelcome at all, the Chancellor really has focused the money he's got on people of working age rather than on pensioners. But context is all, and the context remains one of very big increases in tax over this Parliament, and more forecast over the next few years. Now, interestingly, a majority of that increase has come, rather fortunately for the Chancellor, given the state of the public finances, not from active policy choices, but because the growth we've had has been pretty tax-rich. Growth in high incomes, growth in profits, for example, and in capital gains. The overall rise in the tax burden over which the government has presided, which it has chosen not to offset, is just as real for all that. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Tax has risen to a higher fraction of national income than it has ever been in my lifetime, and I don't expect it to return to its previous level for the rest of my lifetime. In this context, talk of abolishing national insurance does not look realistic. Of course, the Chancellor is only talking about the relatively small part paid by employees and the self-employed, not the much, much bigger part paid by employers. So let's be clear, he's not talking about abolishing national insurance. He's talking about abolishing that relatively small part paid by employees. But this pledge to cut taxes by more than £40 billion goes in the same bucket as pledges to increase defence spending. Not worth the paper it's written on unless accompanied by some sense of how it will be afforded. We also got some rather uncertain and future-focused tax increases. The change to the non-dom regime might net £2.7 billion in 28-29, as the Red Book suggests, but it might not. You could say the same for the £1.2 billion of additional revenue for that year claimed from extending the energy profits levy. Contrast that uncertainty with the certainty with which we can say that cutting the rate of NI will cost in the order of 10 billion a year right away. We got some immediate definite tax cuts, part paid for by a smorgasbord of future uncertain tax rises. In an election year, one can't help but note that the non-dom changes and the extension of the energy profits levy were Labour policies. In the through-the-looking-glass world of pre-election argy-bargy, this will appear to make Labour's job more difficult. They want to earmark the extra revenue from these taxes to fund some of their spending plans. A moment's thought should show this for the nonsense that it is, at least in the real world of fiscal constraints and trade-offs, if not in the rhetorical world of electoral politics. First, the numbers involved are trivially small by comparison with the fiscal challenges. 3 or 4 billion of revenues a year don't even count as a drop in the fiscal ocean when it comes to the scale of the challenges facing us. And second, the fact that changes have been announced doesn't mean the revenue disappears. It's still there, indeed more definitely so. By accepting the NI cut, the opposition, though, does make life more difficult for itself. That's 10 billion a year they've lost. The opposition have been just as shy as the Chancellor about telling us what they actually intend to do on taxes and spending after the election. If I'm sceptical about Mr. Hunt's ability to stick to his current spending plans, I'm at least that sceptical that Rachel Reeves will preside over deep cuts in public service spending. Now, there were things to welcome in the budget: the focus on public sector productivity, what looks like a sensible change to the non-dom regime, the reform to the high-income child benefit charge. It's worth saying that I think the intended reform to make that based on joint incomes is unlikely to happen, but we'll hear a lot more of that from my colleague Tom Wernham in a moment. The choice to cut NICs rather than income tax, all of those were welcome. But this was not a budget which addressed the real challenges we're facing, because it was not transparent about what those challenges are. Government and opposition are joining in a conspiracy of silence in not acknowledging the scale of the choices and trade-offs that will face us after the election. They and we could be in for a rude awakening when those choices become unavoidable. That's all from me. You will now hear from Isabel Stockton on the public finances, B. Boileau on public spending, Tom Wernham on the changes to national insurance and child benefit charge, and briefly from Helen Miller on the non-dom regime. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Slido link which you should have a link to, and vote up the questions you are most keen on, because those are the ones I will see first. There should be plenty of time for questions towards the end. We've got an hour and a half in total, and I sincerely hope my colleagues will have stopped speaking by 10:30. So that should give us plenty of time for questions at the end. I will now turn off my camera, mute myself, and hand over to Isabel.
Thank you. So I will be telling you a little bit about the outlook for the public finances, where we may be storing up some trouble for further down the road. So let's start with living standards, and more specifically with national income, economic output per head of population. That is one of the really key determinants of living standards. So something we're always really interested in as economists. If we look back to the period before the financial crisis, then in the just over a decade up to 2007, we saw pretty healthy growth in that measure of 2.5 percentage points per year. After the financial crisis, that slowed down very substantially to just 0.5 percentage point per year. And on the most recent set of forecasts, it now looks like we are heading for another decade of such disappointing growth. Now, as you will have heard the Chancellor say yesterday, the economy as a whole, in aggregate, is set to grow rather more quickly than that, at slightly over 1% a year. But that really reflects growth in the population rather than growth in the economic output per person. So if we compare this forecast to the previous one made last November, then the population forecast is up, reflecting the Office for National Statistics' most recent population projection. but the labour force participation rate, so the ratio of people either in work or looking for work to the working age population, that ratio was revised down. So more specifically, by the end of the forecast, net migration is now projected to settle at 315,000 a year, which would be substantially up on what we were seeing pre-pandemic. And the participation rate was revised down by half a percentage point to slightly under 63%. Now, another measure of living standards is household real disposable income. Disposable income means income after tax. So on that measure, we do see an improvement compared to November, reflecting the tax cuts announced. But lest we get too excited about that, even on this most recent forecast, disposable incomes are not set to return to their pre-pandemic level before the election. Turning to the public finances, on the revenue side of things, we can see that revenues as a share of national income were really quite remarkably flat throughout the 2000s up until the pandemic, up until this parliament, and have risen substantially since then and are set to continue at a higher level until the end of the forecast period. Now, more on that later. But let's for now look at total government spending, one measure of the size of the state. And on that measure, we can see that even after the huge spike during the pandemic, government spending is set to settle at a permanently higher level throughout the forecast horizon. So in particular, we might like to compare the end point of that forecast, where we're expected to end up by the end of the decade, with the point just on the eve of the financial crisis in 2007-2008. So that was at the end of a decade of new Labour governments. It's not usually a period we think back to as a period of a small state. And nevertheless, total government spending is set to settle at a higher level than it was back then at the end of this forecast period. Now, why is this? One reason behind it is elevated spending on debt interest. But even if we just focus on spending on everything else other than debt interest, that comparison I made remains true. So let's look at debt interest in a little bit more detail. So before the cost of living crisis, we had got used to really remarkably low and stable spending on debt interest, even in the face of a large increase in debt. Now, that increase that we saw from 2022 was not anticipated before the pandemic. We can then see it coming through in successive forecasts as both the size of the spike and the level that debt interest was set to settle at afterwards were revised up and up. Now, fortunately, we have in this forecast had some good news in that lower expectations for interest rates and lower expectations for inflation, which feeds through to the cost of servicing that portion of debt which is linked to inflation. And that downward revision is expected to save us 0.4% of national income. That's about 11 billion in today's terms. Now, it's worth noting that interest rate expectations are pretty volatile, so we shouldn't get too hung up on that specific size of saving. Now, you'll recall that I showed you government revenues are going up over this parliament and setting at a higher level. If we focus within that specifically on tax, then the aggregate tax take is set to rise to just a hair below its all-time record level in the post-war period. And if we look at the increase since the eve of the pandemic, then we can decompose that in a way that can be quite illuminating, in that a fifth of that increase was already known about, already expected ex ante. About half of that increase reflects a more tax-rich economy. So that is wage growth that is concentrated among those who are higher earners, growth in profits that is concentrated in sectors that tend to pay a higher share of tax. So those are things that were not happening through a deliberate decision, an active decision by the Chancellor, but nevertheless, he chose not to offset those changes that were happening in the economy. And the remaining 30% are due to active discretionary tax raising measures during that period. So putting those things together, let's look at the borrowing forecast. And really, there's not that much to see here. So if we think back to November's borrowing forecast and think about what would have happened if the Chancellor had just stood up and sat down again without announcing any measures. Well, then we would have seen some temporary improvement in the borrowing forecast, reflecting largely the improvement in debt interest spending that I just told you about, from lower expected interest rates, and lower inflation. Now, lower inflation is not purely a good thing from the public finances, in that slower growth in cash spending and cash earnings also leads to lower revenues. So that partly countervails that improvement. Now, of course, the Chancellor didn't just stand up and sit down again. We've also had some measures. And if we look at the current borrowing forecast, then it's really pretty much exactly where it was before. If we think about those measures that were announced, then some of the tax cuts were counterbalanced by raises to other taxes. But it's important to keep in mind that these are in some sense not like for like. So the tax cuts, the cuts to national insurance, are immediate. They're pre-election tax cuts. We can be pretty sure of those costings. And we compare that to tax rises that are backloaded, largely coming in post-election, and that are much more uncertain. And you'll be hearing later from my colleague Helen Miller a little bit more detail on one particularly interesting one, the reform to the non-dom regime. Now, just for further context, we can compare this to the forecast made in March 2022 on the eve of the cost of living crisis. So throughout the period that expected a lower level of borrowing, but we can see that borrowing at the end of each forecast was set to settle at a similar level. And we can remind ourselves that this is really quite a tight fiscal policy. This would have seen us running a substantial primary surplus as well. Now, despite that tight fiscal policy, it's not enough to get debt on a decisively falling path. So if we look at the measure of public sector net debt targeted by the government's fiscal rule, then it's really unchanged from the November forecast, in that it is rising in the near term and only just stabilizing, falling by the tiniest of margins in the final year of the forecast. Compare that again to the March 2022 forecast, when debt was said to be falling much more decisively. Now, one way of contextualizing just how small that headroom, in inverted commas, that the Chancellor has against debt falling in the final year the forecast is to look at the OBR's calculation of the probability of debt actually falling when it comes to the fifth year of the forecast. Now, this means that we accept all the assumptions baked into the forecast. We treat this as a central forecast, and we just look at the uncertainty inherent in forecasting. And just that already means that the estimated probability of debt actually falling is only slightly better than a coin's toss. Now, that was treating this forecast as central. As we've highlighted many times, there are good reasons to think that this forecast is in fact not so central. One really salient one is the assumption that the cut to fuel duty will expire and fuel duty will be uprated with inflation. If we account for fuel duty freezes continuing, then that headroom would already be halved. Now, why is it that we can run these large primary surpluses and it's still so hard to get that falling? Well, we, or the Chancellor, are in a really difficult world when it comes to getting debt on a falling path. So on this chart, we can see average growth in the cash size of the economy on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we can see average spending on debt interest, again, as a share of national income. So if you're the government, you would always prefer to be sort of towards the right-hand side and towards the bottom of the chart. You would always prefer to have higher growth and to be spending less on debt interest so as to be able to spend more on everything else. And if we look at parliaments throughout history and compare them to the one that is just ending, then we can see that this was already quite a tricky situation in that we've had not particularly high average growth and substantial debt interest spending. But things are set to get even more complicated in the next parliament under this most recent forecast. Now, some people think that the next parliament is likely to include a change of government. So it can be interesting to think about the last time a Labour government came in. And that was a government that was dealt an easier hand on this measure in that it had slightly higher nominal GDP growth and quite substantially lower spending on debt interest, even with that improvement between November and now accounted for. So that brings me to the end of my talk. We've yesterday seen no meaningful improvement to the forecast for per person economic growth, which can really only be described as dismal. In slightly better news, we are seeing modest savings on debt interest relative to that November forecast, but we shouldn't forget that this would still leave debt interest very elevated relative to what we had become used to throughout the 2000s. The measures announced yesterday involve, quote unquote, paying for tax cuts that are certain and coming in the near term, with tax rises that are backloaded and whose yield is much more uncertain. It should be obvious that this is not a risk-free strategy for the public finances. And rather than being on a decisively falling path, debt remains very elevated. It's rising throughout most of the forecast horizon and only just stabilizing at the very end. This is despite a high aggregate tax take and a high primary surplus, and it reflects the continued challenge from a weak growth performance and high spending on debt interest. And we focused here on the nearer term, but we shouldn't forget about longer term challenges, including the transition to net zero and pressures on areas of spending such as defense, healthcare, and social care. And I will now hand over to Bea, who will tell you a little bit more about public spending.
Thanks, Isabel. I'll now be talking about plans for spending on public services, an area where the Chancellor didn't provide much detail in yesterday's budget announcements. Overall plans were left more or less unchanged, and we still don't know about spending plans by department after next year. What we do have is broad totals of day-to-day and investment spending after next year, and these will be the baseline inherited by the next government before the spending review, which has been promised after the next election. And I'll talk about what these overall totals might imply for different areas of public services. But first, the one real piece of new spending detail we did get yesterday was on the English NHS. So the Chancellor announced a £2.5 billion top-up for NHS England's day-to-day spending next in the coming year, 2024 to 25. And this is just about enough to give NHS England a real terms increase in funding, especially given that there's probably a further top up on its way from what we charge immigrants to use the NHS. But it's worth noting that the actual cost pressures on the NHS are likely to be higher than our measure of inflation for overall public services. Plans remain really very tight, and it's quite likely that we'll see another top up, especially because there's still some unallocated money for day-to-day spending in the reserve for next year. We were also told that an additional £3.4 billion would be reserved for investment in NHS technology from 25 to 26 onwards, as part of the broader plan from the Chancellor to improve productivity across the public sector. And this is a welcome sign of more prioritisation for NHS capital spending, although I should note that it comes alongside the £1.1 billion cut from the capital budget this year in 2023 to 24. It's also quite hard to interpret what this additional funding means in 2025 to 26, since we don't have departmental level capital spending plans as context, so we can't really say what this means relative to already planned budgets or relative to other departments. And this brings me on to the fact that after next year, all we have is these broad totals of day-to-day and capital spending plans, and we don't have detail on how these will be allocated between departments. So thinking first about day-to-day spending, all that we know for certain so far is that this is set to rise by 1% in real terms each year from next year onwards, so between 2024 to 5 and 2028 to 9. But it's very unlikely that this 1% real terms annual increase will be spread completely evenly across all departments. And as I've said, the government's given us no detail on how this will be split. So this kind of will involve some guesswork and uncertainty, but we can come up with what this likely means for different areas, predicated on them sticking to plans. If we assume that the NHS grows in line with the long-term workforce plan, if we assume that school spending is held flat in real terms, that defence and aid spending are held constant as a share of GDP, and that the new childcare announcements are funded, then this implies that these areas will all grow faster than 1% by around 2 to 2.9% on average in real terms each year between 2024 to 5 and 2028 to 9. And these protected areas are quite large areas of spending, so the NHS alone is around half of day-to-day spending, or almost half. And this protection then means quite dramatic real terms annual cuts to unprotected departments in England, which includes areas like prisons, courts, and local government. So we calculate that day-to-day spending in these areas will fall by between 1.9% and 3.5% in real terms each year after next year. And for some context on this, cuts to unprotected departments during the austerity period, so between 2010 to 2015, were around 6% annually in real terms. So it's thinkable that these cuts could perhaps be delivered. But I should note that, of course, departments are starting from a different point. There's a lot of the savings found in 2010 were one-off. And we calculate that to avoid cutting unprotected departments, a top-up of around 10 to 20 billion pounds would be required in 2028 to 29. This is what we think might happen to day-to-day funding as a whole. But the population is growing, and indeed is growing more rapidly than was previously expected, largely a result of higher than expected migration. And this high population growth puts further pressure on many public service budgets, like the NHS budget, schools, courts, and prisons. And we can think about what these rapidly growing population projections mean for per person numbers. And to do this, I'll show you the same graph as I just showed you. So real growth in per person spending between 2024 to 5 and 2028 to 29 will be more like 0.4% each year rather than 1% as a result of the growing population. Using our previous assumptions about protected areas, the cuts look a little bit sharper, or spending plans less generous. And it looks like cuts to unprotected areas will be even more dramatic, so ranging from between 2.4% in real terms to 4% in real terms each year on a per person basis. This is all taking the government's stated plans for spending after next year as given, but we know there's a spending review after the election. At spending reviews, these overall totals of day-to-day and investment spending are allocated to specific departments. And we know that historically, when these cuts are kind of made more explicit, the government tends to allocate additional money to public service spending. And to illustrate this, here I'm showing you the boost to the average real growth rate at spending reviews, comparing what was penciled in immediately before the spending review with what actually takes place immediately after the spending review or at the spending review. So this is a boost to the growth rate to kind of take an average if growth was penciled in to be 3% in real terms. And then at the spending review, top-ups meant that this was more like 5%. Then the revision would be 2 percentage points upwards. And on average, in spending reviews since 2000, the revision to the real growth rate plans for departments' day-to-day spending has been around 1.1 percentage point. If that's repeated this time, it would imply an extra £22 billion of spending in 2028 to 29. And as we've seen, even under our most pessimistic assumptions, this would be just about enough to stop unprotected spending from falling in real terms. The government might struggle to find the money to do a top-up on this scale, and it's not absolutely certain that they will. And just for some context on the kind of starting point, we can think about how day-to-day spending has grown over this parliament. And there are two key points here. The first is that day-to-day spending did grow in real terms, but the second point is that it grew more slowly than was previously anticipated. So thinking about total day-to-day spending over the course of this parliament, this was initially planned in the autumn statement in 2021, or planned back then to be 3.1% on average each year, and is now expected to be more like 2.3% in real terms. And in per person terms, the fall is sharper comparing expectations in autumn 2021 to expectations now, and that's because of the faster than expected population growth. So it's fallen from 2.8% per person expected growth in day-to-day spending to 1.6%. In this context of growth, albeit slower than expected, is important when thinking about the kinds of sharp cuts we've laid out to departments in the future. We've talked so far about day-to-day spending, but I just want to wind up with some context on investment spending. Here I'm showing you public sector net investment as a proportion of GDP from 1978 onwards. You can see that it's currently at a historically relatively high level, higher than its 45-year average. But current government policy implies that it will be on a sharply falling path as a share of GDP, so falling by more than £18 billion in real terms. And that's even the case with Labour policy, which boosts investment slightly. So overall, we've seen that spending plans after the election look very tight, and that's particularly the case for unprotected budgets. And even with the kinds of productivity improvements that were discussed in yesterday's budget announcements, these will be difficult to realistically deliver and will imply a worsening for many public services. The level of these productivity improvements that were hinted at by the Chancellor seem really quite ambitious, although it's worth noting there might be scope for some catch-up since productivity remains lower than it was immediately before the pandemic. There's still no specifics of exactly where the cuts will fall after next year, and it seems quite likely that in line with historical precedents, there'll be future top-ups at the spending review coming up after the election. But this spending review will be full of some quite difficult decisions, and the next government, whoever it may be, will face an almighty headache. And on that note, I'll pass over to Tom.
Thanks very much, Bea. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Wernham, and I'm going to be talking about national insurance, income tax, and child benefit. So if I jump straight into national insurance, we of course had another announcement of a 2p cut to national insurance coming in April on top of the 2p cut we saw in January. And these 4 pence of cuts are marking a change of direction in policy for national insurance compared to recent decades. So from the 70s to 2022, we had the headline rate increasing to a peak of 13.25%. It's now set to be as low as 8%. And that is the opposite direction to what we've seen in the main rate of income tax, which has been coming down. And what that means is that whilst there was a growing wedge between tax on earnings, which NICs are subject to, and tax on other sorts of income, that wedge is being reduced over time, and the Chancellor has hinted that he wants further cuts to employee NICs going forward. But it's important to remember, as Paul mentioned earlier, that NICs aren't just on employees, there are also employer NICs, which aren't being cut. These are actually a bigger deal. They bring in about 1.5 times as much. So even if we got rid of employee NICs entirely, there would still be this wedge in taxation between earnings and other sorts of income. Now let's have a look at what the changes in NICs mean for people at different earnings levels. If I plot that here, so the 4p cuts in total, we can see that everyone above the primary threshold around £12,000 is getting a tax cut from this change, with higher cash cuts going towards those with higher earnings, up to around £50,000, where it flattens off. But these cuts, of course, happen in the context of several freezes to income tax and national insurance thresholds over the Parliament. So if I bring that up here, you can see it's actually a different shape. It's more flat across the distribution, lower earners and middle earners seeing similar tax rises as a result of these freezes. So if we look at the combined effect, it's actually a mixed picture across the income distribution. So about half of employees gain from the combined effects of tax changes over the Parliament, and now the middle, upper middle of the earnings distribution, whereas the rest either see no change or are going to be paying more tax. So the bottom 40% of employees, for example, are going to generally see their tax liabilities rise, with freezes mattering more than the next cuts for them. Also, small tax rises for the highest earning 10% of employees. Now, of course, whilst the cuts have a fairly fixed effect, then the effect of freezes is going to grow over time as earnings and prices continue to grow and the thresholds stay behind. So if we look forward to 2027, we can actually see that more people lose. Only a third of people gain by then, those earning between about 33 and 55,000. And it's also important to note, as I mentioned, that all the tax cuts we've seen have operated through national insurance, which is only on earnings. So if we look at other sources of earnings, for example, pension income, people relying on those sorts of incomes have only seen tax rises as a result of this Parliament's policy. So I've put pension income on there for comparison. And this marks a continuing trend we've seen over the 2010s, which Paul also mentioned earlier. And I can give a couple of examples to illustrate this. So since 2010, if we look at an individual on £25,000 income, we compare an employee with a pensioner, the employee has seen significant falls in their real tax liabilities in today's prices, despite recent freezes, because we had increases to the personal allowance and cuts to the high rates threshold. Whereas pensioners have actually seen their taxes go up slightly, and that's as a result of the fact they used to have a higher personal allowance. They've gained less from increases to that. If we looked at higher income individuals, well, actually, there's been smaller falls in tax liabilities for employees because the system has become more progressive and pensioners have seen a bigger increase. But in both cases, we see a sort of shrinking of the difference in treatment between employees and pensioners. But it's important to note this is a tax-specific thing. There are other ways in which pensioners have been relatively advantaged by policy. One example is benefits entitlements. So if we look at a working age person out of work, their benefit entitlements have been cut since 2010. Whereas if we look at a pensioner with a triple lock in particular, their benefits have increased. So that's tax and income tax and national insurance. Now I'm going to talk about child benefit, where we actually had two big reforms announced yesterday. There's a bit of context first. Child benefit used to be a universal benefit for families with children until 2013. But since then, when the income of the highest income parent in a household exceeds £50,000, child benefit has been gradually withdrawn. And when the higher earner earns more than £60,000, there is no child benefit entitlement. And it's withdrawn through income tax through something called the high income child benefit charge. Now, these 50,000 and 60,000 thresholds have been fixed in nominal terms since the policy came in, falling in real terms. And that's meant that more families have been affected over time, going from 13% up to, well, we were set to see an increase to 30% in April as a result of these frozen thresholds. However, yesterday, the government announced that from April, these thresholds are going to be increased to £60,000 and £80,000 respectively, a cost of just under £500 million. So that's going to mean fewer families affected. Rather than 2.4, it's only going to be 1.8 million. But of course, it's still more than when the policy was introduced. If the thresholds had actually just been CPI uprated with CPI since the introduction, then the 50,000 threshold would have become a 68,000 threshold rather than a 60,000 threshold as it's going up to. So one way to see the effect of these policies is to look at marginal tax rates. And what do I mean by marginal tax rates? Well, we can ask for each additional pound the higher earner in a couple earns, how much do they lose to income tax, employee NICs, or the withdrawal of child benefit? So if I first just bring up the line that we're going to see from April for someone with no children, that's just NICs and income tax. And then I can see if we hadn't changed the child benefit withdrawal policy, what we would have seen is that there would be significant increases in marginal tax rates between £50,000 and £60,000. That's for family with 1 child, 2 children, 3 children, as child benefit is withdrawn the more they earn in that range. And there were higher marginal tax rates for families with more children, because if you have more children, you're entitled to more child benefit. Now, as a result of the policy announced yesterday, we're going to see child benefits tapered over a wider range, as shown in the solid lines there, and crucially, a range that's further up the earnings distribution, so fewer are going to be affected. Now, over the longer term, the government has announced a more radical policy. So many have criticised the system as it works at the moment for having inequitable treatment between 1 and 2 earner families. So cases such as, with the new thresholds, if a couple has an income of 120,000 split evenly, they'll keep all their child benefit. But if there's a 1 earner couple with an income of £80,000, they will lose all their child benefit. So the government wants to move to family income assessment from 2026. But this is going to be difficult, and that's part of the reason it's not going to be coming in straight away. One reason is administrative reasons, actually. So HMRC doesn't collect joint couple income information, and it doesn't have an easy way to match them. There's a reason this policy wasn't designed like this in the first place. There's going to be significant administrative hurdles to overcome. Second reason it's going to be potentially difficult for the government is that this policy is likely going to create winners and losers. Now, we don't actually have much detail on how the policy is going to look at the moment, so we don't know the details of that. But if we just take one example, which we come up with, so let's say the policy remains the same for lone parents, but for couples, we start withdrawing child benefit for joint income between 86 and 106k. In 2026. Now, I've chosen those numbers because overall that policy would be revenue neutral for the government. It wouldn't cost anything, but it would actually have a lot of winners and losers. Over 500,000 couples would lose some child benefit entitlement as a result of that policy. Another 500,000 would gain. On the other hand, if the government tried to choose this threshold, so nobody who currently would see full child benefit entitlement loses that, that's going to be very costly. It would come with a 10% increase in child benefit entitlements. So essentially, to bring this policy in, the next government is either going to have to spend a lot of money or upset a lot of people. So it's looking difficult. And I think it's also just worth taking a step back and reflecting on this change and whether it's an improvement or not. Now, there are principled arguments on either side. You could have different opinions on whether we should have a joint or individual assessment system for child benefit if you want to means test it. But the current system is just a weird hybrid. It's sort of, in some ways, looks at both people's earnings, but in other ways, it's only based on one. The key point is that it means the lower income spouse is irrelevant to entitlement, and that seems like a very bizarre system. There's no clear rationale for that. If the lower earner's income changes, the child benefit entitlement doesn't change. So the government has chosen to move to a fully joint assessment of child benefit, and in some sense that is at least more coherent, regardless of your views on whether it should be overall joint or individual. But it's going to stay the case that we're going to have two completely separate income-related benefits for families with children, both based on family income, yet withdrawn with different rules through different administrative mechanisms. And we have to ask, is this really the most effective way for the government to achieve its distributional aims? We used to have one universal benefit and one means-tested benefit, and maybe it would be better if the government wanted to change the balance of that to just vary the levels of those two benefits rather than creating this very complicated system. So finally, I'm going to look at a combination of lots of the policies we've announced today and a few more. And I'm going to look at the effect of changes in personal tax and benefits measures since April 2019 overall and for each tenth of the household income distribution. So for policies announced this Parliament before the budget, what we can see is that on average this was going to reduce households' incomes by £215 a year. In particular, the top decile losing out because of freeze in higher rate thresholds. But with yesterday's announcements, including the cut to NICs and a few other changes, such as cuts to fuel and alcohol duty, that's going to mean overall households are set to gain £307 a year, or just over 0.5% on average. And all deciles, all parts of the income distribution gaining, apart from the richest 10th in 2024. But of course, the freezes that we've had in this Parliament are set to continue till 2027, and that's going to drag people's incomes down over time. So if I just now focus on this yellow line, which is the proportional change in income as a result of these policies in 2024, and I compare that to 2027, we can see that rather than incomes being boosted by 0.5% in 2024, they're set to be reduced by 0.5% in 2027. So policy boosting incomes in the short term, but set to reduce incomes in the long term. Thank you very much. That's all from me, and now I'll hand over to Helen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tom. So I'm going to finish us up today by talking about how the government changed the taxation of non-DOMs. But first, before we talk about the reform, a quick note on the current regime. So non-DOMs are people who live in the UK, but who are not domiciled here, so are not settled here permanently. The key feature of the current regime is something called the remittance basis, which means that non-DOMs are not taxed on their foreign income or capital gains unless they are brought into the UK. Now, actually, there are very many millions of non-DOMs in the UK, people who aren't permanently settled here, but there's only an incentive to claim the remittance basis if you have enough offshore income and gains that you want to shield them from UK taxes. And in the latest data that we have, around 37,000 non-DOMs are claiming that remittance basis. Between them, they collectively pay around £6 billion in taxes, UK taxes, on their UK incomes and gains. So these are people who have high incomes. On average, they're paying around £170,000 in tax each per year. Most non-DOMs are foreign born, and they stay here for a relatively short period of time. So 90% of non-DOMs are thought to leave the UK within 7 years. Now, there's a strong case for reforming this system. In fact, we wrote about it at the start of this week. I'm not going to drag you through all the details, but to give you a highlight of some of the problems. One of the big problems is the concept of domicile itself. Whether you are settled permanently in the UK is clearly subjective. It's actually quite hard both for taxpayers and the revenue to prove whether somebody is settled. It's also got some really weird features. For example, domicile often matters on your father's domicile, or maybe your mother's domicile, if she wasn't married when you were born and if she stayed unmarried when you were a child. It's anachronistic, it's outdated, it's a problematic basis for taxation. The remittance basis discourages bringing income into the UK. That's also a problem. And although I think there's a good case for not subjecting somebody to full UK taxes on all of their foreign income the minute they put their foot into the UK, the long-run preferential treatment of non-DOMs relative to people who are here, relative to regular residents, clearly has equity issues. So a strong case to reform what we've currently got. What did the government do? They announced that from next year, the new regime will come into place will be based on residence. So nothing to do with your father, much more objectively just based on how long you've been living in the UK. I think big tick here, that's a much more sensible basis for taxation. The key plank of the reform is that there'll be no tax on foreign income or gains in the first 4 years of residence. That's actually more generous within the first 4 years than the current regime, because there's also no tax if you bring your income, your foreign income, into the UK, and therefore there's no penalty for bringing income into the UK. Again, another good feature. And tax after 4 years, you'll be taxed on all of your income and gains, regardless of where they are, meaning that we'll align the treatment of newcomers and non-DOMs much sooner. Now, this is actually an area that's very complicated, the treatment of non-DOMs. There are lots more details here. There are some transitional provisions for current non-DOMs, and it's worth noting that inheritance tax will also move to a residence basis. But big picture, I think the key takeaway is that there are features of this system, parameters that we could debate. For example, reasonable people could disagree on whether 4 is the right number, should it be lower or higher, but there are some really good features here. So residence is a much better basis for taxation. It makes sense to not distinguish between remitted and unremitted income, and it's a much simpler system. So overall, I think a clear improvement in the structure of the system, and therefore a welcome change. Finally, from me on the effects of this reform, let's start with some winners and losers. Some of those coming and leaving the UK within 4 years will be better off because they won't be taxed if they bring their income into the UK. In terms of losers, the government estimates that will be around 5,500 people who will be ineligible for the new regime and therefore see a tax rise. That notably includes those people who stay here for longer than 4 years, but also those who perhaps have been here before and therefore don't qualify for the regime. In revenue terms, it's forecast to raise around £3 billion per year in steady state. And it's worth saying that that's not a huge number in public finance terms, but for a small group of losers, that is a extremely big per person tax increases. We're talking of tax increases of hundreds of thousands of pounds just on average per person. It's also worth saying that there's just a huge amount of uncertainty here around these revenue effects. There's partly uncertainty because we don't exactly know exactly how much offshore income and gains people have, so there could be more or less than we expect. And there's a lot of uncertainty around how non-DOMs will respond to these reforms. Now, there are lots of responses they could have. The OBR discusses this in some detail. I just want to highlight one of the bigger ones, which is migration. So these forecasts already assume that between 10 and 20% of people affected would leave, so non-DOMs would leave the UK. Of course, in reality, the number could, in principle, be lower, but it could be higher. It's also the case that in thinking about future non-DOMs, so people who aren't yet here, but who might have otherwise come here, they might be less likely to come now this new regime is in place. And from a pure revenue point of view, that's a risk because if people aren't here, you don't only lose the tax you were trying to get, the extra tax, you lose the tax you're already raising on these people who have, as we said, very high incomes. So a clear risk there. But that's not to say that the government shouldn't be doing this. So let me just sum up by saying there is a very strong case for reform, and the new structure, although we could debate some of the details, is a clear improvement. But I think it really is worth saying that revenue is highly uncertain. There were a spectrum of reforms the government could have chosen. The government's chosen one on the more aggressive end, so a fairly large reform that comes with higher revenue potential, but also higher risk, because the more you increase taxes, the more likely people are to respond. So thinking back to what Isabel said about the public finances, the government has increased some taxes with highly uncertain revenue takes that come in the future, while cutting taxes where we're much more certain of what the effects are. There's a clear risk there for the public finances, and one that I'm sure the Treasury will want to keep their eye on. But let me stop there and then hand over to you guys for questions. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Bea. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Helen. We've got lots and lots of lovely questions in the Slido. And I'm also joined by some other colleagues who can help answer some of them if need be. I should say we also have thought about some of the other things in the budget. For example, some of the changes to the taxation of property, changes to capital gains taxation, and so on. So if you've got any really nerdy questions about some of the particular elements of tax that got changed, I think we have Stuart on the line, so we're always willing to take those. But I'm going to start with some of the questions at the top of my list. And Tom Rees from Bloomberg wins the prize for having the most popular question. Are you concerned that the OBR's forecasts are far too optimistic? And what would that mean for the next few fiscal events? Relative to the Bank of England and City economists, the OBR is far more upbeat on the growth prospects. Well, they are pretty positive. I think the biggest reason is that they think long-run productivity growth they still think, in a sense, that long-run productivity growth will be halfway between what we had pre-financial crisis and what we've had since then. And I think it's fair to say that they have been consistently over-optimistic on that. But Carl, Ben, do you have anything to add to our view of the OBR optimism?
I don't think I have anything to add. I guess one thing would be, if you were to assume that productivity growth was going to continue at the rate since the financial crisis, that feels to me like that would be a pretty pessimistic scenario to have. But it's also true to say there's lots of uncertainty. Maybe this will continue for a quite while. Maybe suddenly we'll bounce back to what we were enjoying before 2008 without a very good explanation about why the UK and other economies have slowed down since 2008. I think it's pretty hard to predict when we might expect, or the extent to which we might expect productivity growth to pick back up again.
Well, on a more general note, I think it is, I've said this before, but I think it is odd that we have monetary policy based on a really quite different set of forecasts to those that we have fiscal policy based on. And clearly, if the OBR does turn out to be over-optimistic, then all of the things that we've talked about today will turn out to be more difficult than even we have said. I mean, we will look like we've been looking at all of this through rosy-tinted glasses. Richard Partington of The Guardian: has the Chancellor left a poison pill for the next government, either for his own party to swallow if it wins or for Labour? Are the plans undeliverable? Well, he's certainly leaving a very difficult position. I mean, the position, as I said at the end of my introductory remarks, is that I don't think either side is being terribly transparent with us about the challenges that they're going to face. As B set out so clearly, the numbers really do imply, I mean, very clearly, I mean, he just says big cuts to investment spending and cuts to the unprotected parts of day-to-day spending. So you've obviously got choices there. You can top up those spending plans. And again, as B showed, they are regularly topped up in spending reviews. But if you do that, you're either going to have to raise taxes or accept more borrowing and debt. It's also worth saying, I mean, Jeremy Hunt he said at least three things quite explicitly that I don't think, he would do if he were re-elected. He has again said that fuel duties will rise year on year, and this is the 15th year in a row when they didn't. He says he wants to get defence spending to 2.5% of national income. Well, that's an extra more than 10 billion of spending in the context of these really difficult spending plans. The chances that defence spending is going to whiz up over the next 5 years, whilst everything else is squeezed really hard, I think is pretty unlikely. The child benefit changes, as Tom pointed out, moving to joint assessment is A, going to be practically incredibly difficult, and B, will either be expensive or result in a whole lot of losers. So again, I don't think that's going to happen. So I think there's there's an awful lot of stuff here, which is, if not undeliverable, certainly not by my central expectation of what will happen. And all of that, of course, makes things difficult for an incoming government who have been equally, I think, untransparent about how they will make those difficult trade-offs. I'm still running down these very popular questions towards the top. Tim Wallace, this is one for you, I think, Helen. Do the non-dom changes mean Britain is closed for business? How will the global rich respond to the prospect of paying higher taxes here?
So I think the short answer, if you want the one-word answer, is no, it's not closed for business. As I said, there are clearly really big tax increases for some individuals here. So for those people who are here more than 4 years, some of them are going to get very large tax increases. Of course, it's going to have an effect. There are some protections for current non-doms. I didn't run through all the details, but that takes the edge off this regime for people who are already here. And I said, within the first few years, actually, it's a more generous regime. So for most non-doms, the people who come and go, actually, this regime is an improvement in the sense that it's going to be lower taxes, not higher taxes. It's also a much simpler system. So when you speak to people who have to do this system on the ground, a lot of people say, actually, the tests you have to go through to prove that you're not planning to settle here permanently are actually kind of invasive. You have to give lots of personal details. It takes a long time. So it's not a system that people like interacting with particularly, which I think is important. And as I said, there are things they could do with the system that might soften the edges on the design. So they could debate whether 4 years is the right numbers. They could change how they treat capital gains. So, for example, only taxing gains that arise after somebody's moved here and so on. So look, there are big tax increases. There are real risks here, as I set out in my talk. We don't know exactly how the non-doms will respond. They could respond more than the government is expecting. That is a real risk for public finances. But I don't think this is a scare story where everyone's suddenly packing their bags this afternoon.
B, there's a couple of questions here on spending, one from Joel Massey and one from Delphine Strauss, which I think we can probably take together. Joel is asking, is it plausible that cuts to day-to-day spending can be avoided either through efficiencies, as the government's claiming, or through growth, as Labour's claiming? And Delphine's asking much the same. Is there any more substance to Jeremy Hunt's promises on public sector productivity than there has been in previous Treasury efficiency drives? B, do you want to have first shot at that one?
Sure. So I mean, it's not the first efficiency drive that we've seen, but it is good to be focusing on public sector productivity. And it's true, as I said in my presentation, that productivity does remain lower than it was immediately before the pandemic. So that does imply that there may be some scope here to increase productivity. We don't necessarily need to do anything revolutionary here, but undoing some of that post-pandemic hit to productivity could be helpful. Prioritizing NHS technology investments in particular could be good for productivity, but that's quite unlikely to kind of immediately free up cash over the next few years. It starts to be delivered in 2025 to 26. And so that means that it's quite hard to see that these sorts of productivity improvements could mean that cuts to unprotected spending would be avoided and that efficiencies could kind of save unprotected departments almost immediately. We also kind of don't know exactly how the extra investment that the government has promised will be allocated. The overall cash freeze plan for plans for capital spending hasn't actually been changed. And it could be quite hard to see how productivity enhancing investments could be managed alongside the range of other things that the government has committed to in terms of capital spending. So things like net zero and transport projects. Talking about amounts of money being released, not only in terms of timeframes, but that could be a further unrealistic step. You know, even if productivity is improved, that might mean we get better public service performance for the same amount of money, rather than the improvements allowing lower spending for the same level of public service performance. So given how much various public services seem to be struggling in terms of backlogs and things like that, it seems quite unlikely that the government would be able to kind of free up significant additional cash if there's a strong improvement in productivity. Don't know if I've got further thoughts on that.
Great. Thanks. I think there's one or two things. I mean, I am sadly old enough to remember all the way back to the early 2000s when I was in government and we had the Gershon review aiming to get productivity and efficiency gains across Whitehall, and there have been a number since then. With mixed success. I think I'd add two things to what B said. I mean, the first is that one of the problems with public sector productivity at the moment is that there hasn't been enough investment in it over the last decade. The lack of investment in the NHS is itself one of the reasons, in terms of lack of capital spending, is one of the reasons that productivity there has fallen. There was also a question about can efficiency or growth sort out the problems that we've been talking about in terms of choices over spending? In the end, almost certainly not. Obviously, growth helps, but despite what Keir Starmer said a few weeks ago about pulling the growth lever, that lever is hard to find and rather floppy. And whatever efficiencies Jeremy Hunt may be able to find, it's highly unlikely that they will undo the more than make up for the cuts that are implied at the moment. That said, I mean, there's no question that he's absolutely focused on this. I spoke to someone in Whitehall yesterday who said that he's going around Whitehall trying to get everyone fizzing with excitement about public sector productivity. How fizzing they're feeling, I don't know. Question here from Larry Elliott. How does UK compare with Germany, France, and Italy on per capita GDP growth since 2010 and in the years to come? To which I think the answer is we've done reasonably well on GDP, partly because our population has grown. So in terms of GDP per person, we've probably done about as badly as France and worse than the US and Germany. But I don't know if anyone else on the call wants to add to that. It's certainly the case that our GDP numbers flatter our real growth in terms of income per person. Joel Massey, is the average earner paying more or less tax than they were both since the last election and since 2010? And what about low and high earners? Now, I think the answer to that is the average earner is paying less tax. High earners are paying quite a bit more tax, depending on where you put that bar. I'm not sure what the net effect is on low earners. Tom or anyone else, do you have an answer to that?
And I think our sense is, from the work done, like it's probably less than, so more than in 2019, because of the recent freezes, which have definitely dwarfed the effect of NICs. But since 2010, they might still be better off because of those significant increases in the personal allowance, taking many out of income tax or reducing their income tax liabilities. So it depends when you start the clock.
I think it's very striking, actually. I mean, there's a sense of a narrative both about government favouring people over pension age and not being terribly worried about distribution. Now, there are some reasons for both of those parts of the narrative: the triple lock for pensioners, and indeed the way in which very low interest rates have benefited those with wealth, and universal credit and other benefits for working age people have been cut. So there is some truth both for the idea that this is a government not terribly concerned about distribution and favouring pensioners. But if you look at the direct tax system specifically, that narrative reverses. It's very clearly hit high income and high earning people much harder than it has middle earners and low earners, as a result of the freezing of the allowances, the bringing back down of the top, where the top rate bites to 125,000 and having been frozen for a very long time, and so on. So in terms of direct taxes, the broadly speaking, the changes have been progressive. It's also the case that, as Tom laid out, because the pensioners didn't benefit from the increase in the personal allowances in the 2010s, and B, aren't benefiting from the national insurance cuts, is very much something that the tax changes have very much disbenefited, have hit pensioners relative to people of working age. Hugo Guy, what options are open to Labour to fill the £2 billion gap left by the theft of their non-dom policy? Well, there's a strong word, theft, assuming they keep their promise not to increase tax on working people or introduce any new wealth taxes. I'm going to answer that by saying, who cares about £2 million? It's a tiny amount of money in terms of what we're looking at here, and I don't really think we should be. I don't think we should have given Labour any credence or having paid for anything by saying it was going to raise a couple of £1 billion, and I don't think we should think that they've lost £2 billion. And in addition, of course, since that tax change is happening, they will have the £2 billion. What they've lost, as it were, in a sense, is the £10 billion from national insurance. And the challenge for Labour remains to tell us, as the challenge for Jeremy Hunt remains to tell us, what they would actually do come post an election. Would they really introduce the spending cuts that are there, or would they find some other ways to raise taxes? Now, if they want to raise taxes, there are the usual set of ways in which they could do that, whether that's increasing income tax, reducing some of the allowances, increasing capital gains tax, inheritance tax. I mean, we could spend an entire day talking about the range of options that are open to them. Tim Wallace has already had a go, but how tough have pensioners got it? Well, I mean, truthfully, overall they don't have it as all that tough, because their incomes have been rising over time, and for a lot of them, their housing costs have been low relative to those of working age. Our higher earners have traditionally paid the lion's share of income tax. Has this trend increased? Yes, I think I will just give that very quick answer. Now, let me look, rather than just looking at the top, let's see what else we have here in the questions. There's a couple of questions about local authorities. How much trouble are local authorities likely to be in over the coming years? B or Ben, would you like to take those?
Yeah, I can go. Local authorities fall into that pot that we're calling unprotected. So they are, on the face of it, likely to be facing potentially some fairly chunky cuts over the next parliament. Now, for local government, it's obviously complicated because they have the ability to raise some of their own revenue, so it'll depend what happens to council tax. But on the face of it, they're facing a tight settlement. Now, it's worth remembering that they've seen some quite chunky funding increases over this parliament. Clearly, that's been accompanied by some quite severe demands on councils. You can see that in the number of children with ill health or who need support. You can see that in the number of people claiming adult social care, plus all the whole raft of pandemic-related programs and cost of living support programs they've been responsible for. So more funding, greater demands on them. There's clearly lots of councils in financial trouble. And I think that implementing cuts to their spending power, in the region of 3% a year or whatever, the councils are going to find that difficult to deal with, and it's going to be one of those areas where there's going to be lots of pressure for extra funding over the next parliament, unless we can find a way to maybe address some of those underlying cost pressures in a different way. But that's a whole separate conversation.
Thank you. There's a lovely question here. Is all hope finally gone? Let's hope not. Other than that, a question about the health budget. Henry Anderson is asking, earlier this week we said the NHS was on course for the biggest real terms cut since the 1970s. How does that picture look now? And what about the wider DHSC budget? I think but before I think I'll turn to Ben on this one again, actually. But before I say that, I think our point earlier in the week was not that we really thought that the NHS budget was heading for its biggest cut ever. It's just that if you took the numbers seriously, which we didn't, that would be the outcome. But it was bound to be topped up, and indeed it was topped up, and it's topped up just about enough to stop cuts year on year. Not a desperately sensible way of setting budgets. But do you want to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. The first thing is to say that there's something to be said for doing a top up now rather than waiting until the last possible moment. Maybe that gives the health service more ability to plan. I would also say that we were arguing in late 2021 that the settlement at the time for 24-25 looked implausibly tight. So you could see this top up well in advance. It should be no surprise to anyone. I think if you look at the numbers as published, the wider DHSC budget is actually facing a very small real terms cut year on year, but that's before any additional funding from the immigration health surcharge. So what we charge foreigners for using the NHS effectively goes towards the health service. And of course, there could be another top up later in the year. In autumn, top up for the NHS is something of a tradition as we head into our traditional NHS winter crisis. So I wouldn't treat these numbers as final. I think there's still potential for change. And because the NHS budget is now effectively frozen in real terms next year, it won't be facing the cuts that we saw in the 1970s after the IMF bailout. So we've escaped that record breaker.
Well, that's cheerful. If anyone wants cheering up, I definitely recommend they listen to the recent Rest is History podcast on 1974. That really did sound pretty grim. Another health-related question: can you provide some clarity regarding the 3.4 billion capital spend for NHS productivity? Where's the money coming from? How, when will it be spent, and how's this stuck up against the 1.9% annual increase in productivity? Well, I think the answer is it presumably comes out of the overall capital budgets, because this is from next year when we haven't had a spending review, so there's no extra money set aside as far as we're aware. But as we've said, part of the problem with the NHS is it hasn't had these capital budgets. Indeed, I think I'm right in saying that £1 billion was swiped from the capital budget and spent on current just this financial year. I'm going to turn to Ben again to see whether there's anything to add on that, because Ben is the world expert on health spending.
I'm not sure that's true. I think I'd say two things. One is that it's extra spending relative to a baseline that doesn't exist. So extra relative to what? How can something be extra if you haven't told me what you were going to spend beforehand? So that's the first thing. But that even that being the case, I think the more significant aspect is the program of work that's clearly gone on inside government and inside the NHS to work out what sorts of technologies they want to be investing in, what sorts of processes they think are important, what can we maybe replace with AI, transcribing doctors' notes, whatever. And I think that's probably going to be more significant than the precise numbers that they've plucked out the air to say how much extra they're going to spend. We'll have to wait for the spending review for details, and we'll never really know if it was indeed extra to what would have happened anyway. But I still think that it's a welcome statement of intent and a recognition that capital and technology is going to be important if we're to address some of these productivity challenges, rather than just chucking ever more frontline staff into a system that isn't working.
There's a couple of questions here about the fiscal rules. So, Isabel, I'm going to come to you on those. Callum Rutter asked, does the OBR need to be allowed to comment on whether the government is sticking to the spirit of its fiscal rules? Without that power, does the government hide behind the OBR's independence? And there's also a question saying, is it fair that the government's fiscal rules are focused only on the final year, so it can be in a worse place in the final year when compared with the first, as long as they're in a better place in the final year compared with the penultimate? I think the answer to the second question is yes, that's exactly where we are. But Isabel, do you want to comment on either of those two?
For sure, yeah. So it's definitely true to say that the fiscal mandate in particular, that rule to have a lower debt to GDP ratio in the March of the final year compared to March 12 months previously, is quite silly. We've given lots of examples in the past of how changes in that quote unquote headroom don't necessarily reflect changes to the overall health of the public finances. Now, that's not the only fiscal rule in place. There is the supplementary mandate, which targets the current budget, which we are much more fond of. There's also a whole raft of other indicators that the OBR analyzes, and there is, of course, the whole of the discussion that the OBR provides. And it's important to keep in mind that while there could be improvements to the fiscal rule we have, some fiscal rules are more poorly designed than others, no fiscal rule is ever going to be perfect, and no simple fiscal rule is ever going to replace comprehensive, intelligent, in-depth scrutiny of any set of plans. That's too much to ask of a fiscal rule. So I think while it's a good idea to think about how could we change the discourse, how could we maybe focus more on these more qualitative judgments that the OBR is already providing and that other commentators such as ourselves are making. How could we make those more prominent rather than focusing on a headline number that's not particularly meaningful, that's going to be very volatile, that's not going to help the discourse on the public finances, but we also shouldn't expect too much of fiscal rules themselves.
Brilliant. Sorry, were you coming in there, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I mean, obviously, we've been pretty rude about the fiscal mandate and the requirement to have debt falling between year 4 and 5. And clearly it's very, very questionable when you start saying there's so much headroom and then let's just spend a lot of that on, give that away in tax cuts or spending increases, in particular concerns when the forward-looking nature might encourage chancellors to say, yeah, I'll do these tax rises later, like field duties, or yeah, I'll do these spending cuts later, perhaps, like the investment cuts and the day-to-day spending cuts that Bea spoke about. But in some sense, that you might think the fiscal mandate at the moment is having some effects. I mean, imagine if we hadn't got the fiscal mandate in place. I don't know what would have happened yesterday, but it's not implausible to think that perhaps we would have had a 2p income tax cut rather than a 2p NICS cut. Maybe there is some constraint on the government that fiscal mandate is doing. Maybe it is somehow meaning that the public finances are in a bit of a healthier state than they would otherwise have been. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but at least in the discourse, it does feel that perhaps the government would have rather cut income tax, but decided it couldn't afford it.
Right, Stuart, I've got a question for you here. There's a question about the property taxation changes. I don't think we can leave you without giving you some views about the changes to the second properties and the changes to capital gains tax. So, Stuart, now's your moment.
Okay, so I'm not sure what's the question exactly. It's
the question.
I can answer it anyway.
Go on. Yeah, we'll answer it anyway. There is a question towards the bottom which I've now lost, but it's essentially asking what do we think of the property tax changes.
Yeah, so I think I have less strong views on the stamp duty one. In terms of capital gains tax and the furnished holiday lets regime, in both cases, I think there are trade-offs. There are pros and cons to these things. They're making it better in some ways and worse in others. But there are trade-offs because the design of the system's flawed in the first place. So with furnished holiday lets, the issue is that we tax people one way for renting out property, and we tax people another way for running a business. And if you're renting out holiday homes, well, which of those should we tax you like? And the answer is, well, we make different judgments for all of the different taxes in the system. So there are issues there not only with income tax and capital gains tax, but with VAT, with national insurance, with business rates versus council tax, and so on. And what yesterday's reform did was just move that boundary, tax holiday lettings more like we tax rental homes and less like we tax hotels and B&Bs, for example, which will still be taxed like a trade and get various more advantageous tax treatments. Now, that will make more property available for housing. It'll make housing a bit cheaper and more affordable. On the other hand, it'll be bad for tourism. It'll make places more expensive to rent as a visitor. You can take a view as to whether that's good or bad. But fundamentally, why are we trying to tax rental property income differently from how we're taxing business income in the first place? We should be trying to avoid having these distortions rather than just moving where we put the boundary between them. There's a similar thing there with the capital gains tax rate. It's, by reducing the capital gains tax rate on property gains from 28% to 24%, we're moving it more into line with the lower capital gains tax rate that we charge on other sources of gains. In fact, it's zero on owner-occupied property, but it's moving it further out of line with how we tax income. And the gap between the tax rates on income and capital gains for property is getting bigger. And we've argued for many years that actually there's a way of dealing with that, which is to align the tax rates on all of these things, but adjust the tax base to level out treatment between different, avoid discouraging investment. And so there are actually, if you wanted to reduce the the capital gains tax burden for landlords, it would have been better to do that by allowing them to index their capital gains for inflation, or for that matter for an interest rate, rather than just reducing the headline rate. And that can help you escape that trade-off. So I think in both of those cases, there are pros and cons to what they've done, and I don't have a strong view as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. But the reason there are these trade-offs is because the system's not very well designed more widely, and so we'd actually like to have a rather broader approach rather than shifting the dial on exactly where we are on certain bits of the system.
Great, thank you. And that answers part of the question about what, how should Labour avoid all this flip-flopping if it wins power? I think the answer is to have a sensible strategy for the long run across all of the taxes. Mark Shapland has asked, what are the chances of an income tax cut in the autumn? To which I think the answer is, I don't know. That's a political choice more than an economic one. But it is worth saying that because of the structure of the fiscal rules, the horizon will shift out a year in the autumn. That allows the Chancellor to pencil in another year of very tight spending plans, given that he's done that so far. That might open up a little space, a little bit of fiscal headroom, and that might allow him to cut income tax. Though given that he said he wants to abolish national insurance, I think the signals are more that he would do something additional on national insurance. Last question that we are going to have time for. Harriet Line has asked, how much worse off are pensioners overall compared to 2010, and what could the Chancellor have done to help them? Tom, do we know the answer to the question? I mean, how much worse off are pensioners overall compared to 2010? Indeed, are they worse off? My sense is that their incomes are still a bit higher than they were in 2010, even if their tax bills have gone up. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that median income for pensioners has continued to grow. It's moved more in line with the rest of the population compared to in the 2000s, when there was a big closing of the gap. But it's important to note as a caveat, very recent developments in terms of energy prices and things may have hit pensioners harder, and there may be other reasons why some pensioners are still feeling more of a pinch. But yeah, broadly, it is true that pensioner incomes have continued to grow, and pensioner poverty's remained much lower than it was historically.
Yeah, it's a very important point that Tom makes there, actually. The big catch-up in pensioner incomes actually happened in the 2000s more than the 2010s. They've clearly benefited in terms of asset growth over the 2010s, and of course their benefits in terms of pension have gone up much quicker than working age benefits over the period since 2010. We have hit midday. Thank you so much for everyone for attending, but in particular, thank you so much to all of my colleagues, many of whom stayed up into the wee hours and still sounded more than coherent just now. To Isabel and to Bea, to Tom and to Helen, and also to everyone else on the call, and all the other people at the IFS have helped so much. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. We hope very much that we will see you next time, and do keep in touch with all of our election analysis as well. Thank you.